Greetings, everybody. This is Christopher Messina coming at you from the Messy Time Studios on a beautiful summer day here in Florida, May 11th, 2022. I'm joined in the studio today by an old friend and colleague from Chicago, Maureen Selfselecting, who is the executive director of the Chicago branch of Facing History and Ourselves. Did I get that right?
That is correct. Yes.
I got that right. Excellent. Maureen, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm
You
very
bet.
excited to have this conversation.
I love it. And this all kicked off again because you had an event recently that I saw featuring one of my favorite poets ever, Joy Harjo, who was apparently with the third time only poet laureate of the United States or something.
That's right.
And that was brilliant. So give us a sense, like what is Facing History and Ourselves and how did you come to be involved? And tell us all.
Yeah, so Facing History and Ourselves is an education organization. Our mission is to use the tools of history to inspire students and very importantly, their teachers to stand up to racism, to bigotry, to hatred.
Oh, that's an important and big mandate.
Yes, it is a huge mandate, and I think it is it's really powerful in these times now, when I think particularly in our country, but I think increasingly all over the world, the use of history has become politically charged, which I think is really really challenging. And yet I think it is also so important to use history to really as a tool and opportunity for us to dig deep into ourselves and what we understand about our own lives, our own backgrounds. And hopefully by doing that, really build empathy and connection to other people.
And what is the origin of the program? Has it been around a long time? Is it a national thing?
It is a national thing. It was founded by two educators a little bit more than 40 years ago. And I, of course, wasn't there. So, forgive me if I do a terrible job of telling the origin story. But the way that the story has been passed down to me is that this educator was invited to attend. So this is going back more than 40 years ago, before Holocaust education was something that regularly happened, and certainly before there was any mandates for it to be taught in schools. So this teacher, who was a middle school teacher, was invited to go to Harvard to do a deep dive into understanding what the origins of the Holocaust were, and really looking at the Weimar Republic and understanding that there was a range of reasons why people were motivated to vote for the Nazi Party. And then, as things went on, that people, press manipulated people, played things in certain ways, therefore, resulting in the Holocaust. But she thought that it was so important to begin to talk about the Holocaust, and particularly to talk about, that the Holocaust happened not simply because there was this one bad guy named Hitler, but because there was this whole political infrastructure, whole uncertainty at the time, whole economic position that Germany was in that kind of led into that. And at every point along the way, individual people, normal people, had to make certain choices. And she thought it was so important to inspire young people to understand that the choices that they make in their life can have huge consequences for themselves and for other people, and that would be something that should be explored. So she went to that. She was thinking about that. She came back to where she was teaching, which was, in the 70s, in a very under-resourced community, looking at her students who were African American, who were, Latino, and was really struggling to figure out, how do I get these kids to understand about anything that happened in the 30s in Europe, when they are dealing with so much, shit in their lives currently. And so she spent a lot of time trying to figure out how it was that she could help the kids to understand that. And through that, she came up with the kind of core pedagogical approach that Facing History uses for everything, which is that before a teacher should teach any history, the teacher needs to create a space in his or her classroom that the kids feel like they can express themselves, that they feel like it's a safe environment for them to talk about who they are, for them to talk about opinions that they have that the rest of their classroom might not have. You really create a safe container for the kids to really be themselves. And once you've created that, then the next step is to really, as I said before, to really help the kids think about their own identities and the ways in which, they fit in, that they don't fit in. If they don't fit in, why is that? Is it because of the color of their skin? Is it because of, the amount of money that their dad does or doesn't make? The fact that they don't have a dad and the other kids do. So really to think about all of the things about our identities and our histories that impact how we maneuver through the world.
Hmm.
And after doing that kind of deep dive, then starting in with the history and really helping the kids to make connections, just like you struggled with X, Y, or Z, you know, um, kids in Nazi Germany struggled with X, Y, and Z. And just as, you have to struggle to make this choice to vote for this person or this person, if you could vote, what are the things that go into your thinking about that? And helping the kids to really kind of make those kind of connections. And that's how we ask teachers to approach history.
Hmm.
Um, After that, then we talk about the legacy of those histories and how those histories have impacted the world today. And then finally coming out of all of that, then we really challenge the kids to think about, now that you know this history, now that you've made this connection, are there things that you're inspired to do for yourself or for your community that can help to make the world a better place? So that is our pedagogical approach, and that's how we really approach all of the history units that we do. It started off with the Holocaust. Out of the work that we did with the Holocaust, as you study the Holocaust and realize that eugenics was a movement that was very important to Hitler and to them to really frame how they were thinking about Jewish people, and recognizing that eugenics really had its origins in some of our Ivy League schools here in the United States. So then the next unit that Facing History really took on was really a deep dive into eugenics and the study of race in America. And then out of that, we've created a lot of different case studies and really explored a lot of different histories now. So we have a unit on the civil rights era that focuses on the Little Rock Nine. We have a unit on the Reconstruction that really spends a lot of time looking at what happened during the Reconstruction, uh, why Jim Crow started to happen. Um, and um, and there was another one that I was going to say, and I can't think of it right now. But we have a range of historical units that are both American and also, some international history as well.
That is an excellent, well thought out and ambitious program, which I see is being implemented, which leads, of course, to my immediate question around how does this interface with school districts and their current, state mandated curricula? Is this an additional thing, or is this just sort of woven into the web of how the teachers that are participating in your program address their teaching of history? Is it standardized? Can one teacher in 10th grade be teaching this, but the one next door doesn't? I'm just curious, how do you implement it? A brilliant program, but given the limited amount of time anyone has in the day, where does this fit within the school schedule?
Yeah, and I think that is a great question, and there are as many answers to that as there are schools in this country.
Ah,
It's to me, it's been, so prior to working at Facing History, I worked at the ACLU, right? So I don't have a deep background in secondary education, and so it has been to me just such an eye-opening experience to learn how different it is going from school to school, from district to district. And so I'm the ED of the Chicago office. We have offices across the country, and just talking to my fellow executive directors, it's very interesting to hear the different ways in which Facing History does get implemented. So in Chicago, for the past 4 years, we developed a deep partnership with Chicago Public Schools, where we worked with their Department of Social Science and Civic Engagement, and worked with them to kind of map out what they are recommending to their social science teachers as what a year would look like. And and so we have been able with that work to get three of our units. So our Holocaust unit, our our civil rights unit, and our reconstruction unit embedded into three different years
Hmm.
of social science teaching in Chicago. But that it really does look different in different schools and different districts. And yeah, so also different states have different mandates. So in Illinois, there is a Holocaust, or actually it's a genocide mandate. So it's Holocaust and other genocides that have happened. Um, just this past year, Illinois passed, it was the first state in the country to mandate that Asian American history be taught.
Hmm.
But if you look at the language of that law as it was written, it's very broad, and it really does allow the district and, the principals and the teachers to really decide how they want to enforce that mandate.
Interesting. And so that obvious question: how large is the organization? You said you speak with the other executive directors. Is it 50? Is it 600? Is it four? I'm just kind of curious. What's the scale of the organization?
Our budget is about, I think, 37 million a year, and we have 9 offices. And in terms of staff, I think we're at about 150 staff.
Oh,
And the work that we primarily do is really focused in training teachers,
right.
and working in schools. And so we have a lot of staff who are former teachers, former principals, former associate principals who, really know what it's like to try and teach at this level and try and engage with students at this level, while at the same time having to do all the things that teachers have to do. I think we are a very test heavy society, and I think that puts a lot of pressures on teachers to really teach towards having
Oh,
their kids do well on tests, which is
it's a fascinating topic. I had on the show Conrad Wolfram a little while ago, who was his very hobby horse is the wrong word because it sounds like it's not an important thing, but his sort of drive has been around reforming maths education around the world because
ah
you know as he says constantly, since was the last time especially for those of us who work in quantitative disciplines like capital markets, it's like when's the last time you figured out the quadratic equation with a pencil? Right, like the entire approach to the pedagogical approach of the secondary schools to mathematics education is ridiculous. Um, but there's such, and that's why I'm asking the question about how you get stuff done, because in maths education, certainly there's just such a massive inertia to
mm,
push against. Part of it is state mandated testing, right? So until the legislature changes the law, you can't dedicate a huge amount of time to teaching math a different way because your kids have to be prepared for that test, right? So there's so many interacting factors that go into how you alter a curriculum. And then you have time constraints of the day, and then you have the natural proclivity or the desire of the teacher to take a certain approach. Like this, I imagine, is pull driven. You don't go and shove this in people's faces.
right,
It's not the right phrase, but you know what I mean.
right,
It's something that you advertise as available, I assume, and
right.
those districts or teachers who are interested then ask for more, and then it's a process of engagement. Is that kind of how it works?
Absolutely, absolutely right. As a non-for-profit, and we definitely have, a social justice oriented mission. We definitely are not in the business of shoving anything down anybody's throat. Um, and I think that the interesting thing about Facing History, as I said, is that, we were founded by teachers, and it's really, I think, for the vast majority of the decades that we have been around, it's been a word of mouth thing, that teachers have been very inspired by the curriculum and really have found that it has helped them to engage their students in a way that, teaching history is the way that it oftentimes is taught is like incredibly dry, incredibly boring, and also disengaging. And they have really found that the way that we approach it is really something that kids can really lean into. So it's been word of mouth, word of mouth. 5 years ago, we finally hired a marketing person to start to think about Facing History, and how we could be more, I think, forthright in getting the word out. And then, I think, as we talked about, the pandemic has really been a real challenge for so many people in so many places. But we had been investing prior to the pandemic a lot in digital technology and really digitizing a lot of things, as we were seeing more and more schools doing things digitally. And so then when the pandemic happened, I think we more than a lot of other education organizations, had kind of a leg up of being able to say like, okay, well, we can take this professional development training and do it online. And so we were really very fortunate over the last 3 years. Like the numbers of teachers who have been using Facing History has really skyrocketed because we were already prepared to start being able to share things digitally. So it's been great.
How, I have two related questions. One is, how are you funded? Are there service fees for curriculum development? Is it donor based? I'm kind of curious. It's a big budget. Where does that come from every year?
Yeah, the vast majority is philanthropic support. We have
Wow.
yeah, we're really very fortunate to have a lot of donors who really believe in the mission and have been with us a long time, and have also um, you know um, really helped us to make connections to other philanthropists across the country. So that is the main so it's private donors, foundations, and then increasingly, but not in a way that I think is ever going to be sustaining. We do get some fee for service work from schools, from districts. But I think, one of the many challenges our country faces is that I think that the schools, that we still don't have enough resources going to schools. And then, the resources that do go in, I think really that social sciences have been, kind of there has been such a great push for STEM, and I definitely don't want to take away from STEM, but I think, we should continue to add resources both for STEM education, but
Right.
also for social sciences and for civics. I think as much as our country is polarized, I think civic education in our country is still woefully lacking. And
Polarized?
what-
Polarized? I haven't noticed. So a related question would be, how many other organizations like this are there? I mean, is there a huge ecosystem of not-for-profit, philanthropically backed organizations pushing agenda is the wrong word because that sounds loaded, but like it's not a bad agenda, it's an agenda. I want to inculcate kind of educational processes that enable people to be more reflective about how different groups experience history differently, how they're often targeted or not targeted or benefit or don't. All that's great, right? But there's a mission, right? There's someone's throwing money at this. There are smart people focused on making it happen. Are there three other organizations like yours, and like 800? Like, I've got no sense of the scale of what
Yeah,
the
that's
not-for-profit
a
space is.
great question. I think I wouldn't say that there's a ton of organizations, but there are a few. I think that Facing History is unique in that we really are focused on trying to bring history, and to, that we are very um, very careful about bringing history that is written by scholars, that it focuses on primary resources and encourages kids to use primary resources rather than textbooks. Um, so I think having kind of that intersection of things, of using history in the way that we're using history, and really trying to be as diligent as possible, of really bringing like objective history and really allowing kids to see all sides of history, and
Right.
to really, kind of dig into what are all sides of that. The goal is to get kids to be civically engaged, and the underlying belief is that if people are civically engaged, if people learn to care about the society around them, then that necessarily means that they will be less hateful towards other people, right? So I think that that is a pretty unique mission and a pretty unique way of doing things. So I would say, like, in the education space, that Facing History is pretty unique in that. Um, and I think there are other organizations that are more like the Howard Zinn Foundation. Like they have a kind of a more directly like social justice mission than the way Facing History approaches its work.
And that's kind of my next question, is that it's impossible to remove, speaking as a Chicago trained anthropologist, it's impossible to remove kind of a personal bias or a view from anything you approach, right? So leaving aside the vast controversy over the 1619 project and whether that was history or fable, right? Not going to get into that discussion right now. But Zinn's a great example, right? I read Zinn's book because being a Chicago trained student, I'm told to read everything. I read Zinn's book. I think he's an idiot. I think he's wrong. I think his interpretations are wrong. I think vast majority of what he wrote was slanted with a very kind of Marxist view of the world. But he doesn't hide that. So that's
Right.
fine.
Right.
So the reason I raise it this way is not to have a discussion about, political views on history teaching, but it has to come up. I mean, do you encounter school districts where, do any of your programs ever been the hot topic of the school board meeting where some parent stands up and says, I've got someone who's teaching my kids that whatever? Does that come up at all? Or is it really a focus on primary sources and, teacher tries to stay out of the way as to how kids interpret the materials they get? Where in the continuum do you try to land, I guess?
Yeah, I think that, and I appreciate the question because I think that really has been a concern for us. And I think, that we really do also University of Chicago thing, really try and champion and train teachers to like embrace, student-centered conversations and really allow the teacher to be the facilitator, at for middle school and high school, really kind of embracing a Socratic method of
Yep.
teaching. So you provide the primary resources, you really focus on inquiry and asking kids questions and really encouraging them to think about it. And that very much is our approach. So I think, I am grateful that we haven't been targeted by anybody, and I think that is because of the way that we are approaching it, which is very much about primary resources and really helping educators to really kind of center questions as opposed to really, giving kids answers.
Yeah, it's an excellent approach, right? Because I can only, because having children and being part of their education, what I found fascinating is even going to grammar school in the 70s in New York, there was no such class as history. Right? It was social studies then, or whatever it is. But like I haven't seen anything in high school labeled history. And maybe that's changed, right? In college, you get to history 101 or you become a history major. But the whole concept of teaching history, so far as I've seen, kind of evaporated in American pedagogy for secondary education. Has that shifted? Am I out of date? Is that now there are not
Yeah,
history
well,
classes?
I do think that there are more straight ahead histories being taught. And I think also it's interesting. It has been interesting to me. So I also, my soon to be husband has a 16-year-old daughter who goes to Chicago public schools and just took AP US history
Right.
and just took the test on Friday. So I think, and there are a lot of history classes, certainly in CPS being taught. So, so certainly kind of the standards, European history and American history and things like that, but then also increasingly more specialized histories as well. So, so they do have classes on African American history and Asian American history and I'm trying to think what other histories I am seeing regularly taught. But yeah, I think that is interesting because I do hear what you're saying because I think that history does fall into the larger social sciences spectrum, but I do get the sense that at secondary level, they are focusing in on talking about history as history again. And I think, right, so to also like really dig in on that it is so important to help kids understand that like history is something that ought not be taught by textbooks, but really that kids should be investigative about it, that they should go and now with in the internet it's so much easier to find actual I guess copies of primary documents and really kind of dig into history in a way that I think really can bring it alive. That I just in some ways I'm really jealous of these kids because they have so much. These things are
Oh,
all at their fingertip now in a way that they weren't for
can
us.
you imagine? I didn't have to go outside in January to walk to the library.
I
Just,
know.
it's just appalling. Kids
Yeah. Well,
saw.
yeah, and that you
Wow.
don't, that you don't need to get a plane ticket to go and dig into what, the Smithsonian holds. You
Right.
can, it's amazing what kids can do.
That's brilliant. One of the things that I've seen, because my daughter's also done AP European and American history, and my son's coming into that. But the what I like about the approach, if it's done right, and again, many things are perfect in the abstract that are hard to implement. I admire teachers who do this job because it is really, really hard, right?
Yes.
But to be able to, teach something as convoluted and complicated as 19th century American history from 4 or 5 different viewpoints, and being able to manage a classroom without, obviously you're inclined to believe some people were very wrong, right? And some people were very right, but that doesn't change the fact of their perception in the moment. And we had I had a guest on earlier, Dr. Kenneth DeCleva, who was a psychiatrist diplomat, which is not a term I'd ever heard before, but a great guy. And he was talking about, he'd been part of the Hague trial for Slobodan Milosevic, and his whole point about Vladimir Putin is people in the West can call Vlad names all day long, right? But it would be really helpful to understand people like this because they are making history right now, and that history tends to suck pretty badly right now, right? So there's nothing inherently sympathetic about trying to understand a mass murdering maniac, right?
Right.
If by understanding him you could put a stop to this in some way. So I'm encouraged by the idea of the approach, because I imagine, what's the feedback? I've been at this for decades. I mean, you have kind of student testimonials who later went on to become history professors, or just in general gave them a better sense of civic responsibility. Is there some kind of feedback loop in all that, and how you build the case for what you do for others who want to adopt it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is something that I have encouraged us to dig into more, is to really stay in touch with alumni. One of the challenges for that is that the way that Facing History does its work, right, is that we train the teachers, we expose them to this array of things that they can then bring to their classes, but it doesn't, we haven't like put Facing History's logo on,
Right.
the primary resource documents that these kids are looking at, right? So oftentimes kids get Facing History and they have no idea that they have had Facing History. They
Right.
just know that they are really being engaged in history in a way that they hadn't been before. So it's
Huh.
hard. It's it's a marketing challenge that we face.
It is. That's why Intel insisted they stick the Intel Inside sticker on every laptop that went out. Right.
Yeah, yeah, and I appreciate too that, on some level, like, that's really not what it should be about for kids, right?
No.
We really hope that they don't. But anecdotally, um, there are a number of students that I've been in touch with. Actually, I worked after we graduated many years. I came back to University of Chicago and was teaching or was the associate director of the human rights program. I wasn't teaching it. I was kind of running it. And one of the first students that I worked with in the human rights program was from Boston. And many years later, I figured out that he actually had Facing History. And he
Huh.
is finishing up his PhD now. And the focus of his work is actually on nonviolent social movements.
Right.
And he can trace his thing all the way back to, his high school history teachers and how inspiring that was. So, and I do think that if we can, I think that there will be more and more stories like that. But I think honestly, it just, our mission was so focused on helping teachers and helping to do this that we really do have some, I feel like, catch up work to do to really
Right.
kind of dig into what other alumni are doing. We do have oh, I'm very unprepared for this. I can't actually remember what the precise percentage is, but we did do a study of our students in Memphis and found out that the students who had gone through Facing History curriculum were, as they graduated and able to vote, were voting at a much higher percentage rate than their peers who hadn't had Facing History. And that was, in Memphis. So,
Hmm.
and I think like it's that type of thing that to me is very inspiring, right? I really want to know. And to your point, I don't care what side of the political spectrum are. I just want, people
Be
to really
involved.
be engaged.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it has practical real world implications. I have had people tell me, so for my own sins, I've done a huge amount of work in public policy and mainly defense related. Um, And people always ask me like, well, how can you get involved? Like, I don't care about politics. And since we're here in Florida, I said, well, that's fascinating. That's like living in a cardboard shack on a beach with a Category 5 hurricane coming, saying you're not interested in the weather.
Right.
Well, you may not be, but it's interested in you, right? It's setting your tax rates, it's doing all kinds of stuff. And you
Right.
can either let it hit you or you can get involved.
Right.
And
Right.
the without getting, the outcome of the particular mayoral race that led me to leave New York, what irritated me the most was 11% of voters bothered to vote.
Mm-hmm.
11% of eligible voters. This is
Wow.
the group of people that will set your taxes, that decide policing policy, all the things that you all should care about. And you can't be bothered to go stand in line for 10 minutes or at least learn who they are. I mean, it baffles me.
Yeah.
And I like that you're teaching that. This is my agenda, not yours. But that whole thing about engagement, right? Because the political class, they have insulated themselves from accountability in part by making it seem too complicated, like seeming your vote doesn't matter. So to me, the more kids realize that, no, I do need to pay attention. My choices that you pointed out earlier have impacts, right? It's the butterfly effect. If everyone sat back and said, well, why bother? Well, we know what happens when why bother happens. We've got it now.
Right.
How do we fix that? Is that kind of a motivating drive for you and the folks? What's the main thing that made you jump from the ACLU to doing this, if that's not too personal professional question?
Um, that's a great question. So I think one of the things that really motivated me is that I actually firmly believe that education is the key to everything. And so I loved working at the ACLU. I am still, a great fan of the ACLU and really, am grateful to all of the work that they have done. And yet I was really inspired to try and think about, that the ACLU is kind of at the other side of things, right? Things have already hit the fan. People's rights are already being abused. And I was inspired to think about, well, if we could educate kids in a way that really helped them to understand, how important it is to simply be kind to each other, how important it is to be civically engaged, then we might not, have a need for the ACLU to, to be in court all the time. And so I just thought it was the right time for me to make the jump. And it was also really I was really inspired by the challenge of really, learning a field of which I really didn't know a great deal about. So, so that was why I made the jump. And I think, on a very personal note, um, as I said at the very beginning, one of the things that we train teachers to do is to really create a classroom environment where kids really feel safe to be themselves and to really express all of their opinions, even if they, haven't even really fully fleshed out the opinion. The
Sure.
only way that you can flesh out an opinion is by engaging in dialogue and really getting, people to challenge you and to think about it. And you can't create that kind of safe space. It doesn't happen organically. It's something that a teacher really needs to invest their time in. And, going back to when I was in grammar school, I grew up on the northwest side of Chicago, in an area that was Irish, Italian, Polish, Catholic. And, my dad had met my mom in Japan when he was stationed in Okinawa and brought her back. And we were living in this community where there were no people of color, there were no Asian people. I mean, it was, Italians were like the darkest, but it was Polish, Irish. So so my
Italians were not white back then.
right, yes. And yet they fit in, and my brother and sister and I, we were really pretty isolated. And so there is this story that I have told that is, that really does stick with me, that when I was in seventh grade, we were doing American history, and my history teacher started talking about Pearl Harbor, and the kids in my class, like, they all turned to look at me, like that they had suddenly made this connection, that they had always known that I was Japanese American,
Right.
but they hadn't really kind of understood. And so, and then this was the 80s, when at the same time there was this whole backlash against Japan, and for taking over the car industry. And so
Right.
it was
Right.
not a great time to be the only Japanese American
Huh.
kid in a class. And what was painful for me was that I loved my history teacher. I thought, and I do still think he was a great guy, but he was woefully unequipped to deal with that situation.
Huh.
He he kind of froze. He didn't say anything. He never said anything to me about it, but it was so painful to me to like suddenly feel like everybody was was thinking about me as if I didn't belong there. And so, that it really stuck with me. And I really um, have felt like, that kids really shouldn't do that. And it's not that he was a bad guy. It was that he didn't know how to handle the situation.
Right. Yeah, well, it hadn't occurred. And that was kind of my next question around teachers who want to engage in this. It's kind of self-selecting, right? Because the
Right,
teacher
right,
first has to conceptualize that there will be different ways in which students in the class will receive material. You have no
right.
idea what it's going to be like. And that's a fascinating dynamic. I hadn't thought about that. I remember the whole Japan ink was going to take over the world.
That's right.
And to those of us who work on Wall Street, right, that is the greatest lesson ever of overextending credit and hubris, right? They overpaid for everything, right?
Right,
They bought Rockefeller Center for like
right,
$1.1 billion,
right,
and then it fell apart and they sold it back for like 80 million 2 years later. So to us, it's just an example of bad marketalist policy and lack of freedom. It led to a lot of these bad decisions. But for you sitting in that classroom, that was a very different condition.
right,
Huh.
right.
And so those teachers who embark on that, and what's the percentage? I mean, is there a sense of like of all the history teachers in the country, what's the percentage of penetration? Again, this is probably the marketing question for your marketing person, but it's an interesting one, right? Because how many people want to take that step and take that approach?
Right, right, right. And and just to to build on my rant about how social sciences are underfunded, what is very interesting about that question, why it's hard for facing history to say like how much market penetration we've had is that oftentimes it's hard to really get a sense of how many history teachers there are in a given school. Like
Right,
I've had situations where I have found out that because of teacher turnover, the PE teacher was brought in to teach the American history class. I mean, just crazy things like that, where I think usually math teachers and science teachers, they have a more of a sense of understanding what that discipline is before they go into the classroom. I think that for a very long time, social sciences was kind of, oh, anybody can teach it. Just give them the book, have them read
right.
this, give them the homework assignment. And so I think that's one of the challenges is that we face. And certainly, I am optimistic that that situation is getting better, but yeah, you would be surprised if you were to call
Huh.
any like district in Florida and ask them like how many history teachers are in your district. I'm not sure that they could actually give you a straight answer.
I'm going to do that because I sit on PTO boards for my district. They're very involved. I question around the technology, right? Because I remember so many things and people, and this is why I love the show and having people on, right? Because unless you do a deep dive into something, it may be an area you know nothing about. When I found out that the textbook industry
Mm,
ran American pedagogy because, and often it was Texas and California. So the biggest states that would buy the most books drove the agenda for what went into curriculum because the books had to be printed in advance. And I never forget, my cousin moved to Texas from New York and raised children there. And they did homeschooling because she was horrified to find that in the recent revision of a history textbook, American history, right? American history, because it was Texas culturally that drove the decision about one of the books. The point was that Thomas Jefferson got like 2 sentences.
mm.
And the reason was, which I found fascinating, was because, well, he wasn't really a Christian.
Oh,
So because he had written the alternative Bible, like he had done a lot of very interesting sort of questioning about religion. And
right,
because of that, he was deemed to be, by the people who cared,
right,
again, we talk about constantly about diffuse benefit, but concentrated interest, right?
right,
So if 8 people care deeply about something that impacts 1 million, and those 8 people are willing to work day and night to do it, they'll get it done. Even
right,
though other 1 million people might wake up and look at it and go, what? What do you mean 2 sentences? What are you talking about? So long-winded intro. I know we got
right.
you got a hard stop in a second, but has technology changed that dynamic? Because now you don't have to book printing presses months in advance and all this is electronic. Has it made the ability to develop curriculum more fluid and more nimble because of that?
Um, you would think that it would, but those textbook companies are very powerful and have the resources to continue to dominate
Hmm.
the industry. And so I think that for the most part, those, the big textbook companies are still kind of leading the way, even with digitized curriculum. And it is hard. My heart really does go out to teachers. They really do have so much that they have to handle. And, I know, coming out of the pandemic, there has been, maybe not so much in Florida, but in states and cities where kids really weren't able to go to school, like there has been like a real rise in behavioral issues
Oh
that
yeah,
teachers have to deal
awful.
with. And so I've heard from some teachers where they've said, like, it's been, these past 2 years to actually even get to content was a real blessing. That a lot of times they were really just trying to get kids to sit down and focus, and and do the simplest thing, and to
Hmm.
even be able to start to teach was a challenge for a lot of teachers. And so I recognize that it's the hardest job in the world, and therefore that sometimes the easiest answer is to rely on things like textbooks, and
Sure.
to rely on the big names that have these textbook resources. And so for the teachers who really are able to say, like, I want to do something different with this curriculum, I really do want to dig into this history in a way that kids can engage. I recognize that not all of the teachers have kind of the space and the time to be able to do that. So I think, for those that do, I'm so happy that Facing History is here, and that, and also, as we said, like, so many libraries and museums are opening themselves up and making themselves available digitally, and that is happening more and more. And I think it's wonderful, because kids then really do get to engage with the actual objects, rather than, it being filtered by, right, people who have agendas. And I think, what you said about the reality is that everybody brings biases. And one of the things that
Sure.
we have to do with kids is help them to recognize that, and help them to be skeptical of everything, and to really, make their own decisions.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I know you've got to run, so we aim for what we
Yeah,
call
my my thing just popped up. Yeah.
we aim for enlightenment, but we aim for action oriented enlightenment. So, do you have quick burst of advice for parents, teachers, educators, donors? How do they get involved in this? How do they learn more? How do they take control of better educational processes for history for their kids?
I do. I think, first of all, I think, um, I do. I would say to, parents that are listening, try and, advocate for the teachers. I think that one of the things that I am really distressed by is that I think the teachers sometimes are being maligned in the press. And
Mm,
I think that that is definitely not something healthy for this country. I think we do need to have respect for teachers, that they are professionals and that they are really committed to doing the work. And then, for Facing History, if people are interested, our website is
I'll,
www.facinghistory.org.
I'll
And
put it down there.
definitely, like, look into it. And and if you're interested, please reach out to us, and yeah, we'd be happy to engage.
Awesome. Well, Maureen, thank you so much for coming on again. Facing History and Ourselves, brilliant program for improving historical education in the schools. It's been awesome to have you on.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
your time. And we'll put a link down there for everyone, and I will urge them to go donate to their utmost.
Thank you. Thanks. It's great to see you.
Let's enjoy it.
Yeah, it's so nice.
All right.
All
Talk
right.
soon.
All
Thanks
right.
so much.
Take care. Bye.